There were approximately 40 people at the funeral of Joseph Cotten. He died on February the 6th, 1994, at the UCLA Medical Center in Los Angeles of pneumonia at the age of 88. He had been in declining health for several years following a stroke in 1981 that had damaged his speech in ways that had effectively ended the career that had been running since 1938. He had spent the last 13 years of his life in the specific kind of private diminishment that the industry he had worked in for 50 years does not generally acknowledge because the industry is organized around what people can currently do rather than what they have done. And Joseph Cotten, after the stroke, could not do what he had done. The 40 people who came to the funeral were the people who had known him. Not the people who had known him as a public figure, not the audiences who had watched him in Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons and The Third Man and Shadow of a Doubt and the long subsequent career that those early masterworks had generated. Those people numbered in the millions, and none of them were at the funeral. Because funerals are not for the people who knew someone as an image, but for the people who knew them as a person. The people who knew Joseph Cotten as a person were fewer than the people who knew him as an image by a ratio that would have been familiar to him. He had always lived slightly behind the image. He had always maintained, with a consistency that people who knew him described as characteristic, and people who tried to profile him for magazines described as frustrating, a distance between the public figure and the private person that was wider than the distance most public figures of his prominence maintained. At the funeral, the eulogies were warm and specific in the way of eulogies for people who were genuinely liked by the people around them. His wife, Patricia Medina, spoke. Friends spoke. The word gentleman appeared more than once, which is the word that people use for men who are kind and private and do not make their kindness into a performance and do not make their privacy into a statement, but simply are what they are, quietly and consistently, over the whole length of a life. Nobody spoke about Orson Welles. This is the thing that I want you to hold in your mind as we go through this story, my friend. Nobody spoke about Orson Welles at Joseph Cotten's funeral. Not because Welles was forgotten, he was not forgotten. He had died in 1985, and his death had been an event of considerable cultural magnitude. Not because the relationship was unknown. It was very well known. It was the relationship that had produced the two films that were the foundation of Joseph Cotten's claim on film history. But because nobody spoke about Welles, because in 40 years of interviews and in the memoir he published in 1987 and in the conversations that the people who knew him best have described over the years since his death, Joseph Cotten had maintained about Orson Welles a quality of public silence that was specific and deliberate. And that was itself, if you look at it carefully enough, the most revealing thing about who Joseph Cotten actually was. Tonight, my friend, I want to look at it carefully enough. I want to tell you the story of Joseph Cotten, where he came from, how he found the work, what the work with Orson Welles actually was, and what it cost, what he saw during those years that he decided not to speak about, and why the decision not to speak about it, maintained across 50 years of a public career and into the silence of old age, was not cowardice or loyalty in the simple sense, but something more complicated and more human than either of those words contains. Come with me. We are going back to the beginning, to Petersburg, Virginia, in the year 1905, to a family that was established in the specific way of Virginia families in the early 20th century. Not aristocratic, not wealthy in the grand sense, but rooted, connected to the history of the place in the way of families that have been in a place long enough that the place and the family have become part of each other's texture. Joseph Cheshire Cotten was born on the 15th of May, 1905, in Petersburg, Virginia. His father was Joseph Cotten Sr., a businessman and postal inspector who provided for his family with the reliability of a man who understands that provision is his central function and who executes that function with the steadiness it requires. His mother was Sally Wilson Cotten, a woman of the specific quality of cultivated Southern femininity that the Virginia of 1905 produced and expected of its women, which included a love of literature and of the arts and of the particular forms of beauty that the culture had determined were appropriate objects of female appreciation. She read to her son, she took him to the theater. She exposed him, from the earliest age at which exposure is possible, to the idea that stories are the most important things, that the telling of stories and the receiving of stories are the activities that define what is most distinctively human about human beings. She gave him, before he was old enough to understand what she was giving him, the thing that would organize the rest of his life. He was a good student, but not a distinguished one. He was personable and athletic in the modest way of young men who are physically capable without being defined by their physical capability. He went to Hickman's School of Expression in Washington, D.C., which was a school for aspiring performers that the early 20th century, equivalent of the conservatory, a place where young people, who had decided that the performing arts were their direction, went to develop the technical foundation that performance requires. He went to New York. This is the biographical fact from which everything else follows, because in 1924, New York was the only place that mattered for a young person who had decided that the theater was the thing. And the decision to go to New York rather than to find a more conventional path was a decision that the Virginia background of his family made slightly more significant than it would have been for someone from a theatrical family. He worked in the theater in New York through the late 1920s and the 1930s. He worked as a performer and as a drama critic, briefly, for a Miami newspaper, which is not a pairing that tends to occur in the career trajectories of most actors, but which in his case reflected the specific quality of his intelligence, which was not the intelligence of a person who was only able to engage with the material they were performing, but the intelligence of a person who could also think analytically about what performance was and what it required and what the best of it looked like. He was working in theater in New York in 1937 when he met Orson Welles. I need to stop here for a moment and give you the context for that meeting, because the context is the only way to understand what the meeting meant and what the years that followed it produced. And because the context is something that the mythology of Orson Welles tends to absorb into the mythology rather than providing as the specific concrete set of circumstances it actually was. Orson Welles, in 1937, was 22 years old. He was already one of the most discussed theatrical figures in New York. Discussed not in the quiet way of someone whose work is being noticed by the people who notice such things, but loudly, publicly, in the way of someone who has decided that his own importance is self-evident, and who projects that decision with a confidence so total that the people around him tend to accept its premise before they have properly evaluated it. He had done extraordinary things. The all-black production of Macbeth in Harlem in 1936, which he had staged for the Federal Theater Project, had been genuinely audacious and genuinely successful in a way that the theater of the period was not routinely audacious and successful. The Mark Blitzstein opera, The Cradle Will Rock, which he had attempted to stage in 1937 against the explicit prohibition of the Federal Theater Project, and which had ended with the cast performing in a different venue without sets or costumes, while the audience followed them through the streets of New York, had been an event of considerable cultural excitement, and had confirmed Welles as the kind of person around whom events of considerable cultural excitement tended to occur. He was also, and this is the fact that the mythology of Orson Welles does not always foreground, but that the people who worked with him consistently return to in their accounts, extremely difficult to be around. Not difficult in the petty way of difficult people who make small demands and create small frictions. Difficult in the large way of someone whose gifts are genuinely extraordinary and whose understanding of his own gifts is genuinely totalizing, which produces in the people around him a quality of simultaneous attraction and depletion. the attraction of being near someone who is operating at a level that raises the level of everything around them, and the depletion of being near someone who understands himself to be the center of gravity of every room he occupies and who organizes the people around him accordingly. Joseph Cotten was recruited into the Mercury Theater, which was the company that Welles founded with John Houseman in 1937. The Mercury Theater assembled, in its first 2 years of existence, what is now widely considered to have been one of the finest theatrical ensembles in American history. A group of performers who were individually excellent and who were, under Welles's direction, collectively extraordinary in a way that exceeded the sum of what they were individually capable of. Cotten was part of that ensemble from the beginning. He was, in the Mercury's productions, not the lead. The Mercury had one lead, and the lead was Orson Welles. And the nature of Welles's directorial vision was not one that was structured around sharing the lead with anyone. He was, in the ensemble, the person who was often in the scene when Welles was in the scene, who had the lines that came before and after Welles's lines, who provided the presence against which Welles's performances were defined and through which they became visible to an audience. This is a specific and underrated form of theatrical excellence. The ability to share a scene with Orson Welles in 1937 and not disappear, to remain present, to maintain the integrity of a performance against the gravitational pull of a presence as strong as Welles's, to give the audience something worth looking at in the moments when Welles was not speaking, required from Cotten a quality of self-possession and technical security that was considerable. He had it. The Mercury productions confirmed it. The directors and critics who saw the Mercury Theater work in 1937 and 1938 and 1939 described Cotten consistently as one of the ensemble's strongest members, which in the context of that ensemble was significant recognition. The War of the Worlds broadcast happened on the 30th of October, 1938. Orson Welles, with the Mercury Theater Radio Ensemble, performed an adaptation of H.G. Wells's novel about a Martian invasion as a series of news bulletins. In a broadcast that was so convincingly presented in the format of genuine emergency reporting that a portion of the listening audience apparently believed that the Martian invasion it described was actually occurring. The portion of the audience that believed was probably smaller than the subsequent mythology has suggested. The panic that was widely reported in the days following the broadcast was partly the creation of newspaper editors who had a professional interest in demonstrating the irresponsibility of radio as a competing news medium. But the broadcast was real, and the cultural impact was real, and what it did for Orson Welles was what events of that kind do for the people at their center. It made him the most famous theatrical figure in America overnight, and it brought him to the attention of Hollywood. RKO Pictures offered Orson Welles a contract in 1939 that was and remains the most remarkable contract offered to a filmmaker by a major studio in the history of the American film industry. The contract gave Welles what no director had ever been given and what almost no director has been given since: complete creative control. He could make any film he wanted. RKO would provide the budget. Welles would have final cut. He came to Hollywood. He brought his Mercury Theater Company with him. Joseph Cotten came to Hollywood. The first film they made together was Citizen Kane, which began production in 1940 and was released in 1941. The story of the making of Citizen Kane has been told in many forms and from many angles, and I will not rehearse the whole of it here. What I want to tell you is the specific thing about that production that the mythology tends to absorb into the story of Orson Welles' genius, and that the people who were in the rooms where it was made, Joseph Cotten among them, knew and experienced as something more complicated than the mythology suggests. The specific thing is this: the making of Citizen Kane was an act of collective creation in which multiple people contributed things that were essential to the final film, and the mythology of the film which has organized itself around the figure of Orson Welles as the sole creator of the work, is an account of the film that is accurate about some things and significantly incomplete about others. The screenplay of Citizen Kane was written by Orson Welles and Herman Mankiewicz. The precise division of the writing between the two men was, during the production of the film and in the decades following it, a matter of considerable dispute, and the dispute was not resolved during the lifetime of either man. Pauline Kael's famous 1971 essay, published in The New Yorker and subsequently in her collection Raising Cain, argued that Mankiewicz was the primary author of the screenplay and that Welles's contribution was primarily directorial. Peter Bogdanovich and others who were close to Welles contested this vigorously. The credit on the film says, "Screenplay by Herman Mankiewicz and Orson Welles." Both names are there. And yet, the public mythology of the film attributes it, essentially, to Welles, in the way that public mythologies attribute works of collective creation to the most charismatic figure involved in them. Joseph Cotten had opinions about this. The opinions were specific and were grounded in his experience of the production and his knowledge of what Herman Mankiewicz had brought to the screenplay and what the screenplay had contained before Welles's contributions. The opinions were not public opinions, in the sense that he did not publish essays in The New Yorker or give major interviews in which he positioned himself in the dispute over the screenplay. But the opinions were there. He also had opinions about what he saw during the making of the film, about how Welles conducted himself with the crew, with the studio, with the other actors, about the specific quality of the directorial vision, and the specific quality of the person executing that vision, which were not always the same thing and which the mythology of the film has tended to treat as if they were. He did not make those opinions public. Not in 1941, and not in 1961, and not in 1981, and not in the memoir he published in 1987, which was called Vanity Will Get You Somewhere, and which was, by the judgment of people who read it in the hope of the full account that his decades in the industry had positioned him to give, one of the most carefully managed pieces of memoir writing in the history of Hollywood autobiography. The management was itself the story. But I am getting ahead of myself. The Magnificent Ambersons came next in 1942. Welles adapted and directed the Booth Tarkington novel about the decline of an aristocratic Midwestern family in the early decades of the 20th century. It is, in the judgment of many film historians, a film of equal or greater artistic ambition than Citizen Kane, a film whose subject was loss and irreversibility, and the specific sadness of a world that is ending being inhabited by people who do not yet fully understand that it is ending. Cotten played Eugene Morgan, the progressive automobile manufacturer whose love for Agnes Moorehead's character, Isabel Amberson, is thwarted by the obtuse pride of her son, the monstrous George Minifer. The performance is one of the finest of his career, contained, warm, specifically, and precisely right in every scene he occupies, creating in the audience an experience of wanting more than the story gives him that serves the film's elegiac purposes perfectly. RKO took the film away from Welles and re-edited it. This is the other famous fact about the Magnificent Ambersons, the one that makes the mythology of the film tragic in addition to brilliant. Welles was in South America filming a documentary when RKO executives screened an early cut of The Magnificent Ambersons and decided it was too long and too dark and too uncommercial. And they cut 50 minutes from it and added a new ending. And the 50 minutes that they cut were destroyed. And the film that exists today is not the film that Welles made. Joseph Cotten knew what had been destroyed. He had been in the film that was made, and he had seen the cuts, and he understood the difference between what had been in the film and what RKO had decided to leave out of it. He was, by multiple accounts, deeply angry about what had been done to the film. He said so in private to the people around him. He was considerably more restrained, in public, in how he expressed the anger. The Third Man came in 1949. Carol Reed directed it in Vienna from a screenplay by Graham Greene, and Orson Welles appeared in it, not as director, but as actor, playing Harry Lime, the black market penicillin dealer whose existence and whose final appearance from the shadows of a doorway in post-war Vienna produced one of the most celebrated individual performances in the history of international cinema. Joseph Cotten played Holly Martins, the American pulp novelist who comes to Vienna to visit his old friend Harry Lime, and discovers that Lime is dead, and then discovers that Lime is not dead, and then discovers who Lime is and what Lime has done. The film required from Cotten the specific thing that his work with Welles had always required: the capacity to share the screen with Orson Welles and to hold his own. To give the audience something worth attending to in the scenes that preceded Welles's appearances and in the scenes that followed them, and to make the final confrontation, the scene in the sewers of Vienna where Holly Martins faces Harry Lime and must decide what to do about the friend who has been selling watered-down penicillin to sick children, feel earned rather than mechanical. He gave the film what it required. The Third Man is a film about two friends, or rather, it is a film about one man's understanding of who his friend actually is, as opposed to who the friend has always appeared to be. It is a film about the gap between the image a person presents and the person behind the image. And the reason the film works is not only Welles's extraordinary performance as Harry Lime, but Cotten's equally extraordinary performance as the man who loves Harry Lime and has to decide what to do when love collides with truth. If you have seen The Third Man, and I hope you have, you know the ending. Holly Martins stands in a Vienna street and watches Anna Schmidt walk toward him and past him and away. And the camera holds on his face for a moment too long, the moment that makes the ending what it is. And what you see on his face in that moment is not one thing but several things simultaneously. And none of them are named, and the not naming of them is what makes the film last. That is what Joseph Cotten was capable of. The specifically difficult art of conveying more than can be stated, of giving the audience access to a fullness of interior experience without giving them the statement of what that experience is. He used that art across the 50 years of his career, not only in the films he made, but in the way he managed his relationship to his own story. The Hollywood years that followed the early masterworks were productive and professionally solid and artistically uneven in the way of most long careers. Hitchcock's Shadow of a Doubt in 1943, in which he played Charles Oakley, the serial killer who is suspected by his niece of being a murderer and who is a murderer, is one of the finest performances of his career and one of the most underrated performances in Hitchcock's filmography. Underrated because the film itself is somewhat underrated, and because the tendency to focus on what Hitchcock does visually in his best films can obscure what the actors are doing in them. He made westerns and melodramas and prestige pictures and the full range of what a studio contract player of his stature was expected to make in the 1940s and 1950s. And he made most of them well, and some of them, since I am being honest, and honesty requires acknowledging that not all the films were good, not particularly well, though the not particularly well was more often the film's problem than his. He was not nominated for an Academy Award. This is the fact about his career that his contemporaries and subsequent film historians have most consistently cited as an injustice, because the body of work he produced in the 1940s alone, Citizen Kane, The Magnificent Ambersons, Shadow of a Doubt, The Third Man, and several others of genuine quality, is a body of work that most actors who have received the Academy's highest recognition have not matched. He was not nominated. He received, in 1994, a small tribute in the Academy's memorial reel. He did not receive the honorary Oscar that his career warranted. He published the memoir in 1987. He was 82 years old. He had been in the industry for nearly 50 years. He had made films with Welles and Hitchcock and Carol Reed and other directors of the first rank. He had been present for some of the most significant productions in the history of American and international cinema. He had known people and observed things and been in rooms where things happened that the subsequent history of the industry would spend decades trying to understand. The memoir was called Vanity Will Get You Somewhere, which is a title that sounds self-deprecating and is, if you know how to read it, also something else. Vanity is the presenting surface. The somewhere is unspecified. The title is a joke in the specific mode of a man who has spent 60 years making jokes about himself as a way of managing the distance between the surface and what is underneath it. The memoir describes the productions. It describes the directors. It describes the Hollywood social world in the specific anecdotal way of Hollywood memoir. The stories about who said what to whom at which dinner. The behind-the-scenes details that the publicists didn't manage. The texture of working life on the studio lots of the 1940s and 1950s. It is entertaining, and it is specific, and it is for a memoir by a man who was present for what he was present for. Remarkably free of the kind of revelation that the presence would have permitted. It describes Orson Welles. Of course, it describes Orson Welles. You cannot write a memoir of a career that began at the Mercury Theater and includes Citizen Kane and the Magnificent Ambersons and The Third Man without describing Orson Welles. He describes him warmly. He tells anecdotes. He praises specific things. He is the kind of source about Orson Welles that later biographers have found useful for the texture of the Welles story. The details of what it was like to be in the rehearsal room, what the set was like, what Welles was like in the specific moments that the biographers want to bring to life. He does not say what he thought about the screenplay credit. He does not say what he thought about what RKO did to the Magnificent Ambersons. He does not say what he observed about Orson Welles' behavior across the years of their collaboration that was not consistent with the public mythology of Orson Welles as the pure artist thwarted by an uncomprehending industry. He does not describe what he saw in the rooms where things happened that the history was going to argue about. He describes what he was willing to describe. The rest he kept. The question that the memoir leaves open, the question that the 50 years of his public career, with its consistent management of what was said and what was not said, leaves open, is not whether he had things to say. He had things to say. The people who knew him and who spoke about him after his death, carefully and with the specific quality of people who are saying less than they know, make clear that he had things to say. The question is why he chose not to say them. And the answer to that question, I think, tells you more about who Joseph Cotten was than the memoir does. He was, first of all, a man of genuine loyalty. The loyalty was not naive. He was too intelligent for naive loyalty. Too long in the industry to maintain illusions about the people in it. It was the loyalty of a man who had decided that the debts he owed were real, and that the way you honor real debts is by not doing the things that would reduce what you owe them to. He owed Orson Welles. Not personally, not in the sense of the personal warmth that personal debt produces, though there was warmth as well. He owed Welles in the professional sense. The Mercury Theater had been the context in which his talent was recognized and developed and given the platform that made his career possible. Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons were the films that established him as something more than a competent studio player, and that gave him the career he actually had rather than the career he might have had without them. He knew this. He did not pretend otherwise. But loyalty was not the only thing operating in the silence. There was also, I think, something closer to a philosophical position. A view about what the relationship between public and private knowledge should be, about what the people who make things owe the people who consume them, and about what they do not owe them. He had spent 50 years watching the industry's appetite for the interior lives of the people who worked in it grow larger and more demanding and more invasive, and he had spent 50 years declining to feed that appetite in the ways that most of his contemporaries fed it, with the confessional interviews and the candid memoirs and the tell-all books that reduced the complexity of a life to the package of revelations that the market could absorb and move on from. He did not want to be absorbed. He did not want to be moved on from. He wanted what the films he had been part of wanted, which was to hold something back, to keep something in reserve, to make the audience aware of the presence of an interior life without giving the interior life entirely over to the audience's consumption. He had played that quality on screen for 50 years, in the pauses before he spoke, in the way the camera found his face in the moments between the lines and revealed more than the lines contained, in the specific disciplined art of giving the audience access to a fullness of interior experience without completing the statement. He lived that quality too. The silence about Orson Welles was not the silence of a man who had nothing to say. It was the silence of a man who had decided that what he had to say was not for the audience. Not because the audience did not deserve to know, but because the knowing was not what the story needed. The story needed the films. The films were there. They were enough. He was 88 years old when he died. He had been working in the theater and in films for 50 years. He had been, for the better part of those 50 years, in the company of one of the most significant and most discussed artistic figures of the 20th century, in a position of proximity that would have made him, if he had chosen to be, one of the primary sources for the understanding of that figure. He chose not to be, not fully. Not in the way that the biography of Orson Welles wanted and still wants someone like him to have been. He took what he had to the grave on February the 6th, 1994. The 40 people at the funeral heard warm words and the word gentleman and the specific quality of tribute that a man who has been consistently kind and consistently private receives from the people he has been consistently kind and consistently private with. Nobody spoke about Orson Welles. Now, my friend, I want to sit with you in the quiet of what that means. The silence about Welles at the funeral was not an absence. It was a presence of a specific kind. The presence of the thing that the people in the room all knew was there and had all. Following the lead of the man they were there to honor, decided not to make the subject. It was the presence of the 50 years of collaboration and proximity and knowledge and the specific, layered complexity of what you know about a person when you have worked beside them for that long, in circumstances as intense as the Mercury Theater and Citizen Kane and the Magnificent Ambersons. It was the presence of the secret, not a secret in the dramatic sense of a single fact being concealed, a secret in the deeper sense of the complete interior understanding of a person and a relationship and a history that the person carrying it has decided belongs to them and not to the people who want to know it. He carried it his whole life. He took it to his grave. And the choice to do so was not weakness or cowardice or the special kind of self-protective silence that people maintain when the truth would damage them. It was something else. It was the decision of a man who understood the difference between what the public is owed and what it is not owed, and who held to that understanding with the same quiet, consistent discipline that he brought to everything else in a life of quiet, consistent discipline. The films are there. Citizen Kane is there. The Magnificent Ambersons is there in its incomplete form, which is incomplete because of what was done to it, and which is still, in the form that survives, one of the most beautiful films that American cinema has produced. The Third Man is there. Shadow of a Doubt is there. The interior of Joseph Cotten's understanding of what all of it meant is not there. It is gone with him. And the going of it with him was a choice that he made deliberately and maintained completely, from the moment when the choice became available to him until the morning when the making of choices was no longer available at all. Some things are not for the audience. He knew that. He spent his whole career demonstrating it. He carried it his whole life. He took it to his grave. sleep well, my friend. And the next time you watch one of those films, Kane or Ambersons or The Third Man, the ones where Cotten is in the scene when Welles is in the scene and holds his own with a quality that is neither competition nor deference, but something more interesting than both. Watch what he does in the moment before he speaks. Watch the pause. Watch what the pause contains. You are watching a man who understood what it means to know more than you are going to say. He knew more than he ever said about Orson Welles, about what he saw, about what the 50 years of the career contained in the rooms where the cameras were not pointing. He kept it. He had a right to keep it. And he exercised that right as completely and as gracefully as he exercised everything else in a life of genuine, undemonstrative, quietly extraordinary grace.